My first experience of slavery was when I was a child and my parents took me on vacation to Virginia, where we visited colonial-era plantations. Dating from 1619, the Berkeley Plantation is one of the oldest in America. Our tour guide showed us the elegance of the antebellum South. She mentioned it as a site where a Thanksgiving was held a year before the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts. She also noted it as the birthplace of William Henry Harrison, the headquarters of General McClellan during the Civil War, and the place where the mournful bugle call taps was composed. However, she missed the major factor that provided all this opulence: slavery. While masters lived in luxury, their slaves endured short lives in crude, humble cabins. I remember this experience vividly. Later, as an adult, I would witness the remnants of traditional slavery in Sudan and interview Equatorial Guinean exiles who suffered under a more recent form of state slavery. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I go further into my own personal experience of slavery and the slave trade, I first want to define it and look at its early history. Over time, many definitions of slavery have developed, beginning with the anti-slavery movements and later codified by first the League of Nations and then the United Nations. First and foremost, slavery involves labor, which is unpaid. Slaves do not have freedom of movement or a choice of their employment, and they are not criminals. A criminal serving hard labor in a prison is not considered a slave. Slaves do not have a fixed term of service. Often it is considered to be permanent. And part of this is also the fact that slavery is non-contractual. You may have noticed I'm missing some things that perhaps you think are linked to slavery. One of them is ownership. Chattel slavery is when one human being owns another. However, there are other forms of slavery, including debt bondage, in which a person is held for their debts. Because this system is non-contractual, it leads to abuses in which masters charge slaves for their food, clothing, and shelter, ensuring that they never get out of debt. Another form of slavery which became particularly evident in the 20th century is state slavery, in which governments enslave their own people to accomplish national goals by labor-intensive means. Over the ages, a number of practices developed that are comparable to slavery. One of them is serfdom. Serfs are permanent, non-contractual labor. They do not have free movement or choice of employment. However, in a sense they are paid because they are allowed to keep a certain proportion of their produce. Also related to slavery is the system of indentured servitude. Indentured servants provided labor, unpaid. They had no freedom of movement or employment. However, they did have a fixed term set by a contract, even though they were often cheated into extra years of service. Today, both serfdom and indenture are considered slavery-like practices and equally banned in international law. Another thing I haven't mentioned is race. Throughout history, most people have been enslaved by people of a similar race to their own. The earliest forms of slavery were typically the result of wars, where winners enslaved those who lost. This system of traditional slavery was evident in ancient Mesopotamia and Persia, and among the Hebrews, Arabs, and Greeks. This seldom lasted beyond 3 generations, by which time the dominant society would have absorbed the subservient one. Slaveholding was limited, and the few people who could have slaves only had a handful of house servants and field workers. The Nile Valley civilizations appear to have had mass slavery, but not nearly to the extent that the later Roman Empire would. In Rome, the slave class included not only field workers and house servants, but also gladiators and even doctors and architects. Slavery became a profit-driven big business, no longer motivated by absorbing captive cultures. This was particularly true of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, one of the largest slave-holding cultures in history. Whether motivated by cultural destruction or profit, slavery has always been inhumane. Unfortunately, throughout history, Africa has proved to be a prime slave trading area. Reliable numbers are difficult to come by, and so throughout this presentation, in talking about the African slave trade, I will be giving both minimum and maximum figures, the minimum probably being too low and the maximum probably too high. The earliest slave trade between Africa and the Middle East was by the Arabs, whose trade was limited and very much in the mold of traditional slavery. Later, the Turkish slave trade was much more extensive and more brutal. The oldest route taken by slave traders was down the Nile. Later, trans-Saharan routes were developed, and finally, along the Indian Ocean, lateen-rigged ships called dhows brought slaves to Arabia, India, and beyond. Middle Eastern powers dominated North Africa and the Mediterranean. They colonized parts of Europe, including the Iberian Peninsula and the Balkans. The exact number of slaves taken from these areas will probably never be known, but it was certainly massive. Eventually, European kingdoms became empires as they sought to expand. First and foremost were the Portuguese, whose Prince Henry the Navigator set up the world's first naval academy and encouraged innovation and exploration. While Columbus sailed west and didn't find India, the Spanish were able to establish a vast empire in the New World. Meanwhile, the Portuguese were able to get to India by circumnavigating Africa. In the course of this, they became the first Europeans to colonize Africa and would be the last to leave. One Portuguese sea captain, Bartholomew Diaz, got to the Cape of Good Hope on the southern point of Africa and discovered that he could go around the continent. Later, another Portuguese navigator, Vasco da Gama, went around Africa and on to India, where he became the first viceroy of Portugal's colonies there. The innovation that allowed Europeans to do this, the caravel, a lightweight ship that was able to travel all of the seas. The invention of the caravel led to the development of other ships, such as the galleon, which could hold even more cargo. As the Spanish and Portuguese competed for colonies, this drew the concern of the Vatican. Popes were eager to avoid confrontation between these two Catholic powers as the Protestant Reformation unfolded. As a result, several treaties were signed, allowing the Spanish and the Portuguese to divide the world between them. The first of these was the Treaty of Tordesillas, which drew a line down the Atlantic. Everything west of this line would be given to Spain, everything east of this line would be given to Portugal. Later, the Treaty of Zaragoza drew a line down the Pacific. Everything west of the line would be given to the Portuguese and everything east to the Spanish. Later, some variations were made which allowed the Portuguese to take over all of Brazil and the Spanish to take control of the Philippines. These treaties and later pronouncements would lead to what's now known as the doctrine of discovery, which would allow Europeans to pretty much do whatever they wanted in any area that was not Christianized. Many feel this was the beginnings of white racism. To continue my personal narrative of slavery, the first time I truly encountered the transatlantic slave trade was when my wife and I visited Senegal in 2017. Landing at Senegal's brand new airport, we quickly passed through its capital, Dakar, and boarded a ferry bound for Gorée Island. Seemingly insignificant, it is one of the most important sites in the world commemorating the slave trade. Goré's most important site is the Maison des Slaves, the slave house, where I was able to meet with curator Ile Coyle. Inside the slave house is one of Africa's most visited sites, the Door of No Return. Throughout the slave house and its small museum are many mementos of famous visitors, popes, prime ministers, and presidents. Visitors have included Pope John Paul II, Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, along with hundreds of other European, African, and other world leaders. Dozens of other plaques commemorate visits by African diaspora organizations, human rights activists, churches, and artists. European women were seldom allowed to accompany their husbands. This resulted in a lot of interracial marriages and relationships. A mulatto class developed whose women were known as signores. They were very active in the local economy and slave trade. The conditions endured by slaves were horrific. For those captives who were particularly rebellious, there was a punishment cell secured by an iron gate. It was too small to lie down in and too short to stand up. Most visitors to Gorée are day trippers who only stay a couple hours. My wife and I were able to stay there for 4 days in an 18th century house that's now a bed and breakfast. A few steps away from where we were staying is the island's only church. Like the slave house, it had also been visited by Pope John Paul II. The interior has an interesting combination of European and African elements. One prominently displayed statue attracted my attention. It was that of Saint Josephine Bakhita. Born around 1869 on the other side of Africa in what is now Sudan, she was enslaved as a child, freed by Catholic missionaries, and converted to Christianity. She became a Canossian nun and served in Italy for 45 years before dying in 1947. On the 1st of October 2000, she became the first black woman to be canonized in the modern era. She is venerated in the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Communion as a statement against the brutality of slavery. Her feast day is the 8th of February, the day of her death. Although having several hundred inhabitants, Gorée Island is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its numerous monuments and museums make it equivalent to Washington, D.C.'s Smithsonian Institution. Housed in an impressive fortress, Senegal's National Historical Museum has many collections of pre-colonial and colonial artifacts. One prominent resident of the island was the French governor, the Chevalier de Beauflier, an able administrator and poet. He became an outspoken advocate against slavery. His house is a major landmark. Though a living reminder of inhumanity, Gorée is peaceful and beautiful. For the Senegalese, it is a respite from Dakar's urban bustle. While for the international community, it has been the host of many conferences, including HIV workshops and meetings of heads of UN peacekeeping missions. My next experience of the transatlantic slave trade wasn't until 2023 when I visited Ghana. For much of history, Ghana was known as the Gold Coast. To the east were the present-day coasts of Togo, Benin, and the southwestern point of Nigeria, which were collectively known as the Slave Coasts. This region was a highly populated gap in the West African rainforest, which made slave hunting easy. In 1471, the Portuguese arrived on the west coast of Africa. 11 years later, they would build the castle of St. George of the Mine. It was a major center of gold trade, even though there were no mines there. Its foundation stones were actually carved in Europe, sent to Africa, and put in place. One of the early visitors to Elmina was a youthful Christopher Columbus. By the early 1500s, this outpost came to trade in slaves as well as gold. Like castles in Europe, it has a drawbridge and a moat. Everywhere there's exquisite brickwork. My guide was local historian Richard Seaworth. Passing into a large courtyard, he showed us a punishment cell for Africans who didn't want to be slaves. Nearby was another for Europeans, primarily drunken sailors. Here, and again just to the east, at the gigantic slave castle at Cape Coast, is a plaque which reads, "In everlasting memory of the anguish of our ancestors, may those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots. May humanity never again perpetuate such injustice against humanity. We, the living, vow to uphold this." The castle was located for easy access to the sea. However, on the nearest hill, Fort St. Jago was built to guard the area. In 1637, the Dutch took over Elmina, and with it Fort St. Jago, which they renamed Fort Conradsburg. Much of the castle's present-day appearance dates from this time. Many features of Dutch rule survive, including the administrative block and its grand staircase. Today we're inundated with many logos. Apple, McDonald's, Amazon, Mercedes-Benz, and many others. However, I want to draw your attention to the most powerful corporate symbol of all times. It appears in the upper left in the center of the Dutch flag. It is a symbol of the Dutch East India Company, the most successful corporation of all times. Across the central courtyard from the administrative block is a rather strange-looking structure. This was the original Portuguese chapel, which almost certainly had a cross above it and probably a bell tower or spire. The Dutch took over Elmina at the height of the Protestant Reformation and unfortunately desecrated this Catholic sanctuary. As a practicing Protestant Christian, I can't tell you how offended I was to know that this holy place was turned into an auction house for slaves. Today, it is a wonderful little museum which celebrates Elmina's local culture, its past rulers, its famous metalworking and wood carving traditions, and later its contact with Europeans, first through the gold trade and then the slave trade. Elmina is well known as a fishing port. the noticeable features around this area of the coast are salt pans where seawater is evaporated to provide essential salt in this hot, humid climate. Elmina is also the site of the oldest Catholic basilica in Africa. Nearby is a Dutch cemetery dating from the 1600s. Located halfway between the castle and Fort St. Jago is the bridge house built by the Dutch, which today is a hotel. Here are some clips of street life in Elmina. As the British were building their empire in North America and the West Indies, they also established a presence on the West African coast. Their first foothold was Fort Meadowcross at Dix Cove. Later they took over and expanded the Danish slaving station at Cape Coast. These were the foundations of the greatest empire in history. Cape Coast Castle is a massive structure. Like Gorée Island, it has become a pilgrimage site for the peoples of the African diaspora. My guide was Freeman Zinjakpour, who proudly pointed out the mementos left behind by world leaders, including Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. In addition to being a slave trading center, Cape Coast Castle was also an administrative center for the British, and standing on a promontory, its fortress provided defense for the area. Here's a video clip that shows its location well. Next, Freeman would take me to visit the slave dungeon. The center photo shows you the maximum amount of light that would enter the dungeons during midday. At the dungeon's lowest level is a traditional Akan altar. Throughout the castle, but particularly in the dungeons, there are wreaths, flowers, and mementos recalling the horrors that happened within these walls. Here are some film clips of the area between Cape Coast and Elmina along the Atlantic. Many stone barriers have been erected to prevent coastal erosion. These shores, which saw the departure of thousands of slaves, are now lined with plantains, bananas, coconut palms, cafes, and shelters for fishermen. Ghana's modern-day capital, Accra, also saw the presence of Europeans. In the southeastern neighborhood of Usu stands Fort Christiansborg, the largest Danish slaving station. It would later be taken over by the British, become the residence of Ghana's presidents, and today is used for state functions. When the British came on the scene, they established themselves in Jamestown, which is a neighborhood that still has many remnants of that era, a fort, a lighthouse, churches, and old buildings. Eventually, the British would displace all the remaining Dutch and Danish forts and control the whole of Ghana. As I mentioned earlier, determining the exact number of slaves transported from Africa is very, very difficult. However, there are some facts that we know. The leading destinations were Brazil, the Spanish Empire, and the British and French West Indies. The most famous route was the Middle Passage between Africa and the West Indies and North America. There was also the Southern Passage between Portuguese colonies and Brazil. The slave trade between Africa and the Middle East probably took roughly the same number of slaves. However, it was over a much longer period of time. The European trade was shorter and more concentrated, and as such had a much greater effect on the local economy and society. A highly profitable trade system developed known as the triangular trade. Cheap iron goods, textiles, firearms, and alcohol would be brought to West Africa, where they would be traded for slaves, who would then be taken on to the New World. New World goods would be loaded onto the ships, including sugar from the West Indies and tobacco from Virginia, and only later cotton. This was one of the most profitable trade systems in history because at all times ships had a full cargo. However, this was not easy, and particularly transporting slaves between Africa and the Americas through the Middle Passage was particularly brutal. The very first slaves to come to what is now the United States were Irish children who were shipped throughout the British Empire by the thousands. Another ship which braved the Atlantic crossing was the Concorde, which is also known as the German Mayflower. It landed in Philadelphia on October 6, 1683, carrying a community of Mennonites from Krefeld in northwest Germany. They were settled in an area which became known as Germantown, which has long since been absorbed by the city of Philadelphia. Their leader was Franz Daniel Pastorius. Unlike most immigrants, who typically do not become politically active for 1 or 2 generations, Pastorius and his followers became immediately active and issued the first anti-slavery protest in the New World. The fight against slavery was long and hard. One of the major proponents against slavery was George Whitefield, a Methodist pastor who was run out of South Carolina for setting up a school for slave children. He settled in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. There he encouraged incoming Moravian immigrants to settle. You can see their attitude on slavery and race as is shown by this marker of their cemetery. Not surprisingly, Pennsylvania became the first free state. Anti-slavery sentiment increased. However, by the time of American independence, there were only 5 free states. These did not include some states that would later become bulwarks of the Union in the Civil War, such as New York and New Jersey. The conscience of some slaveholders was tweaked by the sentiments of American independence, and momentum against slavery built. However, it was across the Atlantic in England where the anti-slavery movement made its first important gains. Olaudah Equiano was a highly educated freed slave whose impressive memoirs would galvanize the British Empire against slavery.
"O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, lend you this from your God? Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends to toil for your luxury and lust of gain? Must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed to your avarice?"
Returning home after a night out on the town, London barrister Granville Sharp encountered a badly beaten black man in an alleyway. He took him home, nursed him back to health, but was then sued by the slave's owner for the return of his property. This case passed through the British courts and eventually led to slavery being banned in the British Isles. Another abolitionist was Thomas Clarkson, who investigated slavery by going from port to port, particularly the English port of Bristol, frequently assaulted. He composed diagrams and models showing the inhumane conditions of slave ships, which would later be used by other anti-slavery activists. Another famous figure from this era was John Newton, a slave ship captain whose conscience bothered him and led him to become an abolitionist and Anglican pastor. He is famous for composing the hymn Amazing Grace. The most powerful voice against slavery was that of William Wilberforce. Despite failing health, for many years he was the chief voice against slavery in the British House of Commons. Women played an important part in slavery and the slave trade. However, they were also extremely active in the anti-slavery movement. One of their most powerful protests was a boycott of sugar and other West Indian goods. These activists and many others formed the British Anti-Slavery Society, the world's first human rights organization. As we will see later in this presentation, slavery is by no means dead, and this organization ultimately became Anti-Slavery International, which is still active against this inhumanity. After decades of activism, the British Parliament made the slave trade illegal for British subjects in 1807. Pressures by abolitionist groups led to the slave trade becoming illegal in the United States as a result of the U.S. Constitution's Article 1, Section 9, which forbade the importation of slaves after 1808. The brutal transportation of captives across oceans ended. Slavery itself did not. In the early 1800s, slavery was banned in the British Empire, Denmark, and France. When Portuguese slave trading ended in 1842, it was then illegal in all of Europe and the Americas. However, illegal trading continued, which was ended by British naval patrols during the 1840s. However, the United States diverged from other major powers. It was only in the midst of the Civil War that the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves. This was formalized with the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. One common misperception of slaves is that they are mere passive victims. However, throughout history there have been many rebellions, probably the most famous being that of Spartacus in ancient Rome. After the independence of the United States, several important slave rebellions occurred. In 1811, a rebellion in New Orleans was put down brutally, as is shown in this stunning memorial. The most famous rebellion was that of Nat Turner in 1831 in Virginia. However, this was only the tip of the iceberg. Elsewhere in the New World, slave rebellions proliferated. In Cuba, Brazil, San Domingo, and the British West Indies. However, it was in the French colony of Haiti where the most dramatic events unfolded. There, Toussaint Louverture led the Western Hemisphere's second country to become independent. However, this was marred by the slaughter of over 6,000 French, which is now considered a genocide. Something I've often mentioned before is that the victims of one age feel justified to become the perpetrators of another. The colonialism which followed slavery proved slightly better in that it provided some social and economic development and didn't move masses of people. However, this was little comfort for many oppressed millions. Slavery is not just a historical phenomenon. In fact, there are more people enslaved today than there have ever been in history. Many people use the term modern slavery, which I dislike because there's nothing new about it. It's the same old inhumanity that's existed for many millennia. While slavery has been expunged in Europe, the Americas, Southeast Asia, and Oceania, it is very evident elsewhere. In Mauritania and parts of West Africa, Sudan, and the Arabian Peninsula, traditional chattel slavery continues, while in Ethiopia and the Indian subcontinent, debt bondage is still very much a fact of life. But the place that probably has the most slaves, although records aren't really available, is North Korea, where the numbers enslaved by a communist regime exceed all others held in bondage throughout the world. As we face the legacy of slavery and the slave trade, complex issues emerge. None of them are easily solved. Compensating those who suffered is not merely a question of color. Only a very small proportion of whites owned slaves, and indeed, slaves were also held by non-whites. Meanwhile, other Europeans oppressed in the old country arrived in America after slavery was long dead. Should those fleeing the Holocaust and the Iron Curtain be penalized by being labeled with white privilege? Determining who was oppressed and who benefited can only be revealed by years of research and genetic testing. But do we really want to go down this route, reminiscent of the Nazis? Yet racism exists and something must be done. Wherever slavery has occurred, it has had enduring effects. Here you can see an example of how geography, geology, history, race, and politics have come together in Alabama.